Hi and welcome to this English context PowerPoint for Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. All images used in this PowerPoint are of the public domain. We're going to look at 3 key points of context. We're going to look at the poet himself, we're going to look at the meaning behind the name Ozymandias, and we're going to look at what was going on in Britain during the time the poem was written. So first of all, we have to look at the poet Percy Shelley and how he was in his life. And we need to know he was part of a poetic movement known as the Romantic poets. They were poets who wrote a lot about politics, art, and they focused on humanity and how it functioned. So you know that Ozymandias straight away definitely makes a political statement. He was considered an inspiration to a lot of the poets that came after him, such as Alfred Tennyson and Robert Browning. You might recognise those 2 names as they're also in your Conflict and Power anthology. He was quite controversial in his time. The reason he was so controversial is because he started to focus very heavily on equal and social rights. He believed that everyone should be treated equally, and he wished for even animals to get treated with respect and humanity. He even allowed his wife, Mary Shelley, to publish Frankenstein, which was a gothic horror novel, and that was completely unheard of for women at the time. He disliked authoritarian governments and rules. He thought that people who were dictators or tyrants would never be remembered, and he liked to remind people that power never lasted forever. He also believed in non-violent protests. People who used violence to get what they wanted were destined to fail in his eyes. You can clearly see this opinion in Ozymandias when he talks about rule failing over time. Now we move on to Ramesses II, which on first appearance might be something rather unusual to talk about. However, it makes more sense when I tell you that Ozymandias is what the Greeks used to call the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. He thought the name was quite flattering, so he used it. Ozium means breath or air, and mandate means to rule. So in other words, the name Ozymandias implies power. He's considered to be one of the most famous and most influential pharaohs in all of Egypt. He was also called Ramesses the Great. Even his people admired him. Under his rule, the culture of Egypt flourished and the country became rich. And that seems like a really good thing, and it doesn't quite paint the same picture as the Ozymandias in the poem. However, Egypt only flourished because he had a habit of conquering neighbouring lands, and he would use the money and wealth that he obtained from conquering small countries to better his home country. So he was a bit of a tyrant himself. After his death, 9 more pharaohs would take the same name as him, in a way of sort of honouring him. So his name meant a lot to the Egyptians. However, it doesn't mean so much to us, and that's ironic, given that in the poem, Ozymandias claims to be the king of kings, and yet he's not remembered by anyone in Britain. So what was life in Britain like when the poem was made? Well, King George ruled as the British monarch, and that's very important when we consider the rest of the things about him. He was considered by other countries, and even his own people, as a tyrant. Someone who used violence and power to get what he wanted. You can clearly see some similarities between him and Ozymandias. During his reign as king, Britain started to lose their ground in other countries. They pretty much owned half of the world by this point, but people were actually starting to fight back and start gaining independence for their countries. They didn't want to be ruled by Britain anymore. So under his rule, lots of wars started to break out. The biggest loss for Britain was America. During King George's reign, America and the people living there decided that they didn't want to be under British rule anymore, and they wanted their own country. It was a big financial loss for George III. After this poem was published, George III became very ill. He'd been mentally and physically ill in life, and his rule came to a tragic end. Now that that you know that, my advice would be to try and revise these 3 points. For every quote you look at, try to create a sentence that includes one of these 3 key points of information. If you need to know how to do this, have a look at my last PowerPoint for bayonet charge. Try to further your research on the 3 topics discussed. The poet, Percy Shelley, more history regarding Ramesses II, and also think of what was going on in Britain at the time that this was written. Good luck.